Hi. There might be a few people who are still coming in. I hope they won't be too disruptive, but we've wanting to make a start. And I do want to welcome you all to this really important launch of a new book, Seeking Asylum and Mental Health. It's a practical guide for professionals, but I know that the room is full of both medical professionals and legal practitioners, and the importance of meeting together is to see what we can learn from each other, but in particular learn from the very many different ways in which this collection of chapters addresses the myriad of different ways in which medical problems, medical practitioners have to engage with our clients in the legal process of seeking asylum. What I want to do, first of all, is for each of the speakers to introduce themselves. My name is Stephanie Harrison. I'm a barrister practicing in Garden Court in this field. So that gets that out of the way. The format for today, I hope, is going to be very interactive. It's going to be in the way of an exchange and a discussion. But because we know there are many people in the audience who have expertise, who have contributed to the book, we hope that there will be, we're open for people to make contributions as the discussion goes on. If I can manage that, if that becomes too unwieldy, we can't make progress, then I'll have to say, let's have questions at the end. But our purpose is to be as interactive because we want this to be an exchange of ideas and experiences. And so that's the way in which I hope that I can facilitate a discussion. So what I'm then going to do first is to ask each of our speakers to introduce themselves and to tell you a little bit about their backgrounds before we go into the question sessions. So I don't know if we could start with Julia.
So I'm Julia Nelki, and I'm a retired child psychiatrist and family therapist, and I worked with refugees in Liverpool for a long time, and for Manchester, freedom from torture, writing reports for them. And I still work a bit with refugees in psychotherapy gardening projects in Liverpool, and for an organisation called Refugee Resilience Collective, which offers support to volunteers working in Calais.
I'm Chris Maloney. I'm a psychiatrist and a GP. I was a consultant medical psychotherapist in East Berkshire, and then for various reasons I became a GP partner in Hackney in East London. And there, I think, because of my psychiatric background, I started having conversations with the patients I was seeing who were refugees who were seeking asylum. And in 2003, I did my first report on one of my own patients and got a taste for it. That was for Michael Hanley at Wilson Solicitors. And then I started my own expert witness practice and did both physical and psychiatric reports for people in the asylum system for about 20 years. So that's really how I learned what I did. It was a very instructive experience.
Okay, so I'm Alison Summers now. I'm a psychiatrist and a psychodynamic therapist, and I've worked with refugees since 2008. First as a volunteer psychotherapist with freedom from torture, and more recently writing reports. And now what I do mainly is write reports for a tiny organisation called Torture ID, where we're aiming to try and make medical reports more widely available by writing shorter reports. I've also got other mishmash of different experience. So, for example, working with a community refugee organisation, working with an NHS trust trying to develop its refugee response, working with local authority, looking at health needs amongst refugees.
I'm Ronan Toal. I'm a barrister here also, and I've been doing refugee and immigration work for donkey's years. And that has obviously involved a lot of engagement with medical evidence. and particularly in the context of, I was in the legal team in the case of KV Sri Lanka, which was about evidence of physical injuries, and then also in the legal team in MN and IXU, which was about, amongst other things, about psychiatric evidence and evidence of sort of mental harm done by experiences of trauma. I know those words might be subject of discussion.
Thank you. So I was going to kick off really, and Julian, maybe you could answer, maybe you could start with this question. I wanted to know, it's obviously very timely, this book, but what was it that, why this book? Why did you come to decide that this was something you wanted to get involved in, and what were your purposes and aims in putting it together?
But before I answer that, I think if Julia just reads it a little bit.
Yeah, I wanted to start with
yeah.
reading an extract written by someone with first-hand experience of seeking asylum, of the asylum system, just to bring them into the room, really.
And I think it says a bit about why we did.
Yeah. Okay. So this is Khalid's story. The journey of asylum is very difficult because it is a journey towards the unknown. This unknown is always accompanied by anxiety that makes a person live on one thing, which is hope, because he has no choice but to cling to hope. I came as a refugee to this country. I left behind my work and the income from which I lived, as well as my family. I didn't turn back. In the beginning, my anxiety was to get rid of the anxiety that I lived with in my country. And I thought things would go as I wished in the beginning, with the fear dissipating. I thought of my family left on their own, but that my wife and children will soon join me. And this separation will not be for long, maybe a few weeks or months. Every human being has energy in the beginning. I had a great deal of it. I was happy that I survived and to present my asylum papers. As time passed, my energy started running out, and that the longing for my children and my wife began to hurt when I slept, and I saw their pictures and talked to them. The most difficult torment in the world is the torment of waiting, because it transforms you into something else in which you lose your personality, image, voice, and humanity. When you know that the state doesn't care about you as a human being and throws you away for so long.
Well, I understand why that was important for us to start by listening to the lived experience. And in that context, then perhaps you could elaborate on why you came to put this book together.
Yeah, and I guess it just illustrates it's been very motivating, the work that we've done. And I think the idea for the book came first from Chris, that we have all been part of an online group for several years, and more members here in the audience, a group of psychiatrists working with refugees who met roughly once a month for an hour as a CPD experience. And we were aware that there was no straightforward practical guide for clinicians working in this field. I'm particularly aware that of the many books around on refugees, there was none focusing on the very particular situation of people who are still seeking asylum, who are waiting for a decision. So we were acutely aware that we were 3 white psychiatrists of a particular era, and so we were really keen to involve other people, not just because of the value of different perspectives in enriching the task, but also because of the range of thinking within mental health, which people outside the field may be less aware of, how many of the, to what extent that some of the core aspects of psychiatry remain contested. And so having people from different clinical backgrounds, different personal background felt really important, and especially having input from people who've got personal experience of going through the asylum system, who could speak from that perspective. And we were helped by a number of people in that position who spoke to us specifically for the book, which I think gives something different from encountering people with your professional, in your professional role. I think you learn differently when you're meeting people for a different.
I think it grounded, I mean, I think it changed the way that we wrote, actually.
Yeah.
And I think it also changed, you know, helped think about what the priorities were. That people were bringing what their priorities were rather than the professionals' priorities, and the importance of focusing on that.
Yeah, that I meant to say, I think that the book just evolved. So we don't really have a template to start with. I guess every book about mental health is going to say something about assessment, something about diagnosis, something about treatment. Beyond that, felt like it was a bit of a blank sheet, and we spent a lot of time talking to each other, talking to our contributors, chapter editors, talking to people who are kind enough to read drafts of chapters for us, writing and rewriting. I think we were very irritating probably to some of our chapter authors, but it felt like the process helped crystallize our own thinking about what felt important.
I think one of the things we wanted to do as well was tell a story in the book, and I think that that was quite important to us, that it should be the sort of book you could start at the beginning and read it through to the end. And that meant that we were doing the task both of having a very diverse range of people contributing to it, but also having very definite ideas, as you were saying, about how we wanted it to be and what we wanted to be in it. And I think maybe our authors could talk more about what it was like being edited by us. I think several of you were surprised that we were quite so hands-on in how we were wanting the chapters to develop. But hopefully that has lent the book a sort of flow that will be picked up by people who read it. The other thing, I suppose, that I wanted to say is that certainly if you look at the chapter list, as you're saying, Alison, the chapter headings are very traditional medical model, but what I enjoyed the opportunity to do was to subvert that medical model as much as possible as we were writing it, and think about, well, what do you mean by formulation? What do you mean by diagnosis? What do you mean by treatment? And
what do you really think?
Yeah, and what do you really think? And what's actually going on? And the medical model is just one way of describing something, but it happens to be how we describe it. And I think, particularly for lawyers and other people who are reading the book, one of the things we were hoping to offer is a bit of an insight into how mental health professionals think and what they actually think they're doing when they're making the diagnosis, and the fact that a diagnosis is just one way of describing a complex reality of a person in front of you, and it doesn't really have much of a real existence as a categorical entity. It's just a construct for trying to make sense of the world. So we were hoping we could get those sort of ideas across, with as light a touch as possible.
So looking at it from the two perspectives, in terms of what was your idea about how medical practitioners might use your book in the first place? How did you think they would use it as a resource? What's it going to add to their work?
Well, I think probably the first thing that we wanted to get over to people is that for this group of people who are in the asylum system, their mental health issues and the fact of their claim is completely inseparable. It's tied up with the whole of their internal experience, because it is such a potent source of anxiety and insecurity, and that really has to be appreciated by the mental health practitioner. That the asylum claim is not a side issue. And I think the worst mistake that people in health services can make is that when somebody comes in distress and all they want to talk about is their claim and whether the doctor or the nurse can do them a letter for their complaint, their claim, that doesn't mean that they're malingering. That doesn't mean that they're just trying to get an advantage in the system. which is some of that can be an attitude that springs to people's mind, particularly if they're not in dedicated mental health
Or it
services.
could lead to them just being rejected. I actually sat in a triage interview with somebody who was who'd been referred for a psychological service, and it was a phone interview, and the phone on speakerphone, and the nurse said, "So what's your problem?" And this person said, it's one of the people who wrote in the book actually, Alina, she said, it's the asylum system. And the response was, "Oh, well, you come to the wrong place." And it took some re-steering of the conversation to avoid her just being immediately excluded. So the reality is, because the asylum system feels like the problem. But I think one of the first things, as you say, for mental health staff is recognising that there are things that we can do to help in that situation, not about getting a grant of asylum, but it's about helping people cope with it, I think, in that.
But also there's Bernice's chapter at the end on therapeutic complexity can be how someone begins with this idea of it's all about the asylum claim, and actually when you get to know them and you unpick the story, you can get a lot further. And it was very much about not going with this surface presentation as well.
And so from the other perspective, Ronan, you've read the book, how do you think it might be helpful to legal practitioners?
I mean, it's a really great thing when you're a lawyer and you get a medical report, a good medical report amongst your papers, because I think one of the people that is quoted in the book says that my getting refugee status was all down to the medical report. And that very often is the case. And a good medical report is, an extremely powerful document. And I'm often amazed by the kind of elucidation that one finds in a medical report of the person that you meet as your client and have a sort of brief and quite formal encounter with. And the kind of understanding and insight that a good medical report can bring to the predicament of that individual is, I'm often quite amazed by. And the great thing about this book is that it provides a kind of holistic assessment, which is something we're always required to do when looking at medical reports, but it's a kind of holistic account of what goes into sort of producing a good medical report. I mean, one of the interesting things I think as a reader of it is that the book consistently insists upon the multiple domains within which an individual's mental state or mental health has to be located and assessed and understood. I mean, starting with the sort of international geopolitical situation in the world economy, and sort of descending through a national political system and the social and cultural state of affairs, down to the individual's family situation and individual experiences. And particularly, as we've already been discussing, the prominent position given to the experience of trying to get to a place to claim asylum, and then going through the process of being an asylum seeker. So the book insists upon locating its discussion in each and all of those domains. And the book also is, it's absolutely clear from reading it that it's based upon a huge sort of body of professional experience of engagement with asylum seekers and the predicaments of asylum seekers, and of intense reflection upon the practice of that engagement, and also clearly discussion amongst practitioners of that process. And that all, it makes such interesting reading, and it makes it possible to understand far better. I mean, firstly, I think the predicaments of our clients, and then secondly, what is involved in writing a medical report and what a medical report can do. And I'll just mention a couple of particular chapters that I found of particular interest, given my interests. I mean, one was I think the chapter entitled was Assessment, and it's where there is discussion of sort of asylum seekers as narrators of their own experiences, and the kind of factors that might determine a narrator's competence and skill as a narrator, or lack of competence and lack of skill. And it was a very, very interesting discussion of what affects the person's narrative competence, both as their particular personality and in a particular time and place and situation in their lives. And I was also very interested in the discussion of formulation versus diagnosis and the interrelationship between the two, which I think we might discuss a bit further on. And another very good thing about the book is its engagement with and signposting of literature that touches upon all of these issues. So it certainly encourages me to go and read a lot more stuff about this. But it's definitely a book which I would recommend to lawyers and judges. I think it would shed a whole lot of light upon what we do and what we're dealing with.
So I wonder then, has the book met one of your aims then in terms of informing lawyers about
Thinking about the two types of reports in the chapter on reports, so that the professional witness and the expert, and the difference between being asked to write a report by a solicitor or by a lawyer for the purpose of the court report, and the way that people keep medical records and don't realise that these might be used in court, and the importance of writing what you see rather than making assumptions, and being very careful in what you write, because any of your records or letters or anything could be called to court. And I felt that was quite an important thing.
And it reminds me of one of you asking something what we're hoping for, and it just reminds me that one of the motivations for me was working in an NHS trust, which is in an area of where dispersal to that area is relatively new. So lots of clinicians have never, we're seeing asylum seekers for the first time. And there's kind of a great wish to be really helpful and a horror at knowing nothing. And so really quite basic bits of information are not part of people's training or experience, and it's not easy to find.
I think we're also saying it's not about necessarily doing more, it's about working differently. It's just giving people kind of keys or guides to what things might make a difference. Quite small things might make a big difference.
And so I think Ronan's picked up there on some of the themes that he thought were important from the book, and we can discuss some of those. But I wondered if that coincides with your ideas about what you found to be the key themes across these many different areas that the chapters cover. Chris, I don't know if you can comment on that.
One of the themes was, I suppose, about treatment and how treatment takes place at many levels. And it can mean so many different things, from the experience of simply being able to tell your story to somebody, which is a very powerful remoralizing experience for people in this situation. And I think that applies both to telling their story to a mental health professional, but also telling their story to a lawyer. And some of the lawyers in my experience spent a lot of time getting people just to talk about what had happened to them and explore their experience, and found there were really important bonds for people who've never really been listened to before. So treatment, it means many things, and it can mean simple experiences of care. It can mean the look in somebody's eye when they take you into a room, or whether they explain things to you. It can mean that we then have a chapter on specific treatments, which involve drug therapies and psychotherapy and psychosocial treatments, but also finishing off with making some intervention in the asylum claim itself, which is, and I think this is back to one of the things we wanted to emphasize to healthcare professionals that simply writing a letter or noticing something, or actually simply taking care about how you write something in the notes can be a very powerful form of treatment. So we really wanted to get that idea out there. If you want to make a difference, if you want to have an effect on a humanitarian basis for people, these are the sort of things you can do. And often they're quite simple and they don't involve doing a whole lot of extra work.
Or taking extra time.
No.
There's a nice example in the book in Kevin's account, who told me how his encounter with Piyal Sen, who's in the audience, had given him a great sense of relief from having told the story. To somebody who agreed with him that his difficulties were due to his detention. Now, I don't know if Piyal actually agreed with it because I didn't see the report or hear Piyal's take on it. But that was his experience of the encounter, and to him that had been a really valuable addition to his the things that kept him going, I think.
I mean, the other theme that I think is important is the about thinking about the context and the resources that people come with. I was thinking about with chapter on children and families and the importance of the community link, of knowing how few resources people seeking asylum have, and how much you have to work on improving the community links, or making sure that they've got some kind of strengths or basis in which to even look at the vulnerabilities or their situation, because that's the amount of loss that they've suffered is huge. So and that kind of comes through the whole book, really, about the importance of establishing resources or links or connections that somebody's got, balancing strengths and vulnerabilities in the important parts.
So just picking up on that, you can't look at it in that part of the reason why you can't look at it just as a traditional patient-doctor relationship, because there's so much more involved here about listening, about validation, about recognizing that in order to assist this person, you've got to do much more than diagnose an illness and provide treatment. You've got to also look at, as you said, the
You might have
person.
to translate a letter. I mean, you might have, and just be a bit more flexible when you're, we're not necessarily just making a diagnosis. So.
The standard thing, you can't assume that the standard approach will necessarily be relevant or helpful. But I guess the other thing is that a lot of the things you're advocating that's nice for people who are seeking asylum, about being treated kindly and listening to, it's great for everyone if you get that.
Well, kindness is very important, isn't it? And I did spend a lot of time co-writing the book about kindness, so I thought about it a lot. But we now have a system which has made unkindness a tool of public policy, actually, and I think it's a sad state of affairs when that's happened, and so unkindness is somehow portrayed as being rigorous and a way of defending our boundaries and a way of looking after our own people, and it's a nonsense, really, because I think there's a often when this thing is discussed, there's a confusion of two ideas. One is about whether you rigorously maintain your boundaries and you do have borders and you scrutinize people's claims effectively. And it's a separate issue whether you want to do that or not, but you might agree that that's a good thing to do. And but you have to do that if you're running an immigration policy for a country. But the issue of how you treat people whilst you're doing that is a completely separate. And if you treat people with respect and kindness and consideration, you are likely, there is evidence, to get better results. It doesn't mean you're being soft if you treat people with respect. It doesn't mean you're being credulous. It doesn't mean any of these things. It just means you're treating people with respect and you don't make a bad situation worse, and that gets lost. So cruelty gets conflated with rigor, and that's an error, but it's there.
Yeah, so when I looked at the book, it seemed to me that one of the big themes that comes out of it is the fact that the system itself harms people, and I wondered whether, you know, I'm right in that does seem to be a recurring theme across the book. Different ways in which you document how the hostile and unkind, cruel system has its own impacts on the mental health of people.
May I go on?
Yes.
This is box 3.4 from chapter 3 in the book, and it's entitled "What Helps People Grow Through Adversity?" And it's about all the things that if you have something really horrible happen to you and you manage to get away and you need to recover, this is about all the things that help safety and security, interpersonal bonds and networks, feeling validated for who you are, what you do and what you offer, dignity, being able to make decisions large and small about your own life, etc. These are all things that the current asylum system actively undermines. If you want, and the converse of these things on this list are the risk factors for the development of psychiatric illness. So if you want, to use that term, if you want a system that will foster and promote the development of psychiatric illness in people who have been exposed to severe adversity, that system would look very like the UK asylum system. It's what we do to cause trouble.
So I was wondering, though, looking at that from the perspective of a legal practitioner seeking to assist this person obtain asylum and international protection, it does create a difficulty, because what we're increasingly seeing is that the Home Office will actually rely on that very fact as to say, well, actually the presentation with a mental illness is a reaction to being refused asylum or to be facing deportation. And the question of what's the cause of what you were making a diagnosis of a particular condition, whether it's depression or PTSD. The lawyers are interested in why has that person got that, because they're looking for the medical evidence to support their claim. So that seemed to me to be one of the big issues that we do face. And I don't know, Ronan, if you could say how in the case work at the cases at the moment, this whole question of, well, could there be other explanations other than the one that the individual has given for why they're experiencing these sorts of psychiatric disturbance, how that's playing out in the case law, and then we'll come back to see how you dealt with that in the book.
I mean, one of the great things about having medical evidence to support your case is that it addresses what the courts have called the notorious difficulty that asylum seekers have in proving their cases. And I mean, it's potentially an extremely powerful way of addressing that difficulty. But one of the deeply depressing things about the approach taken by the tribunal, probably more than the courts, is the way that they have systematically and concertedly and with a significant amount of thought come up with ways to diminish the persuasive force of medical evidence. It is a very systematic kind of concerted effort that they have made. And one of the key and endlessly repeated kind of means that they've arrived at to diminish the significance of a medical report is to say, well, there are alternative possible causes for what you present with. I mean, even a judge as good for immigration purposes as Andrew Collins, when he was the president of the tribunal, he was the author of one of these dreadful tribunal decisions that provided a template for kind of marginalising the significance of medical reports. And one of the things that he said was, well, these asylum seekers come from countries where there's plenty of discrimination and pervasive violence, and they go through the difficulties of claiming asylum. They may well have spent an awful lot of money to come here, and they're therefore faced with the dreadful anxiety of having to go back to their country, wasting their time and money. All of that is bound to sort of give rise to the kind of medical problems, psychiatric problems that people are presenting with. And that's a theme which was taken up with a vengeance by his successor as president, Mr. Justice Ousley. And he highlighted the fact that, in his view, a lot of asylum seekers come from quite unpleasant countries, so the prospect of going back there is kind of fairly predictably going to cause sort of mental distress. So he just kind of developed the theme which, surprisingly, Andrew Collins, of all people, had set in motion. And it is a very common response to a medical report, which on its face would seem to help the asylum seekers, to say, well, there are other possible causes. And there was a case in the Court of Appeal earlier this year, which I think was called LM Albania, which was about a woman trying to, well, the issue was she or was she not a victim of trafficking in the very recent past? And she had quite compelling medical evidence in support of her case, but it documented a life full of most dreadful traumatic events from her early childhood, up until the events that she was claiming showed that she was now a victim of trafficking. And the psychiatric reports diagnosed her as suffering from complex PTSD and had identified an array of experiences which could contribute to that diagnosis. And so the Court of Appeal said, well, the Home Office and then the tribunal that had rejected her claim to be a victim of trafficking was entitled to say, as they did, that there were alternative explanations for her kind of presentation, not the ones that she claimed. So that is a real issue that people seeking to rely on psychiatric evidence are confronted by. And I think it is a real issue that the writers of reports need to be able to grapple with. And the discussion of formulation in the book, I think, is potentially part of a way of grappling with that issue of into alternative causes.
Because it's what you're suggesting then is that the argument would be that anybody who's been through, for example, the asylum system in this country has so many reasons for being in mental distress that automatically they are just as equivalent cause as anything else that's happened to them. There's I don't know how many people know Catch-22. There's a statement in that just because you're paranoid, it doesn't mean that they're not out to get you.
Yeah.
Now that was a joke that had a great currency when we were youths. But there is a concomitant to that, which is just because they're out to get you, it doesn't mean you're not paranoid. And I think that's what the case is for these people that we're talking about. Just because there are all these bad things going on around you, it doesn't mean you haven't got psychiatric illness. And that, so I've seen that several times in reports by other medical experts that I've been going head to head with. They essentially use the argument that because everything can be attributed to these other events, that somehow diffuses the argument that anything's arisen from this. And there's a misunderstanding of causality, because causality in psychiatric or psychological arena is not either or, it's both and that everything builds up on top of everything else. So if you've had a lot of other bad things happen to you, then you're more likely to be affected adversely by another experience. And I have a bit of a chip on my shoulder about the suggestions in the new Istanbul Protocol that we should be using similar terminology for assessment of physical injury, where you have very clear scars, and for assessment of psychological injury, where it's an entire state of the psyche that people are in. And I think if you take a very concrete approach, which is quite appropriate for a burn on the hand, and try and apply that to a post-traumatic state, you get these sorts of errors. That's exactly what we're talking about. And you also buy into that idea that this scar could be caused by this or that or the other, or indeed it could have been inflicted by the person themselves. And that is not how it works in the psychological arena. But I guess there are other people in the audience who have feelings and experience of this. David, you're waving.
Well, I think it's fascinating subject. One of the problems, of course, which is what you highlight here in the book, is that the structure of argument is built on physical illness. So there's an illness, there's an etiology, and there's a treatment. So then the kinds of questions are geared to that kind of way of thinking. Where, of course, as you're saying, psychiatric illness is entirely different. But the thing that I wanted to bring to that is, because if you have that kind of model of physical illness, then you can say, okay, what's the treatment then? Good, they can get that treatment in Algeria and in Iran, so off they go. I mean, there isn't a problem. And I just, it's very important to get over the fact that the pharmacological treatment in these situations is virtually of no use at all. And the thing that makes the situation different is the treatment, so to speak, the most successful treatment is the current social context in which they're living, where they're free from persecution, they're often being supported by friends and relatives. They're not even engaged with mental health workers or social work. So the removal from that context is predictably catastrophic psychologically, and the representing in the case where they were traumatized is predictably catastrophic. So it's to get into the report that the treatment, the most important treatment, is a social context, and therefore removal from that treatment context, which cannot be replaced in the country because it doesn't exist, is predictably.
But I think it's the same with the diagnosis, isn't it? You can't just have, it's not just the fact that they've got PTSD, so it's what is all around that. It's all the other aspects that need to be part of it. It's not just a
Well, that's the
diagnostic
problem.
category.
PTSD sounds like pneumonia. They've got that, ICD, X, Y, Z, and it's so important to explain that privately.
So I wonder what anyone else thinks. So it's going to become a very important question. So I don't know if people are aware, but it's been a long time in the coming, but the Istanbul Protocol on Assessment of Torture and Ill Treatment has been reissued just recently. And one of the things that it does do is address what we were probably more familiar with when it's physical injuries of this nomenclature of consistent, highly consistent, typical diagnostic, if you're able to exclude other alternatives. And it suggests in the new Istanbul Protocol much more clearly that could be adopted for psychiatric injury. It doesn't mandate that that's what you do, but we know that the courts have said that as far as physical injuries are concerned, applying the Istanbul Protocol methodology is the gold standard. It means that evidence is capable of corroborating the account. It has evidential value and therefore can be used to discharge the burden of proof so that the person succeeds in their asylum claim. So it's become incredibly important in terms of making sure your medical evidence is going to have an impact in the asylum claim. So if we are to read, whilst the Istanbul Protocol doesn't mandate that same approach, it does say it's valid. And I think it is a concern that because we are in this environment where really it's all about, it's a series of hurdles to come and get across, that certainly the Home Office may say if a psychiatrist or a psychologist doesn't go through that task, that will somehow limit it, weaken and make their reports less effective, could even be rejected because they haven't done it. Ronan's explained how the court is looking at saying, well, that particular psychiatrist didn't distinguish between a history of childhood trauma and a recent account of trafficking, therefore we're going to reject the account of trafficking as the cause of the PTSD. So I think if anyone else has got a comment, maybe because you've got your hand up, Professor Katona, maybe you could make an observation about that.
Well, can I go back half a step? And I think it's dangerous to think that the differences between psychiatric illness and physical illness, because most physical illness isn't like scarring either.
Sure.
And if you're thinking of diabetes or high blood pressure, there may be genetic contributions, there may be environmental contributions, there may be dietary contributions, and so on. And the maintenance or treatment of the diabetes or the high blood pressure or whatever it is going to be complicated, and the social setting may be just as relevant as it is for many mental illnesses. So I don't think we should, I think we become vulnerable as psychiatrists if we say, well, you know, medical illness is one thing, and we can talk about causation, but psychiatry is different. Well, it's scarring, but it's different. But as far as the Istanbul Protocol is concerned, or the new Istanbul Protocol, I was at a meeting just the day before yesterday, which was a sort of medical launch for 22 revision of the Istanbul Protocol in the UK. And one of the themes that came out of that was that, or certainly for me, was that these words, consistent, highly consistent, and so on, are used in one way in common parlance. They're used in a second way in the description of marks on the body, and they're used in a third way, distinct from both those others, for the consistency or otherwise of a psychiatric diagnosis with an attribution. So I think that the problem's more complicated, and as Stephanie said, there's also the notion that we are given the opportunity of using these words, but we're not obliged to do it. And I agree that there's a real problem in using words in ways in which not only are they going to be misunderstood because they're easy to misunderstand, but they're going to be misunderstood willfully and maliciously. And that, I think, is the real problem. And I wonder whether at this early stage in the adoption of the Istanbul Protocol, one of the things that we should be doing as doctors and lawyers together, or particularly as psychiatrists and lawyers together, is to say something about the rather restrictive context in which it might be helpful to talk about these words in a psychiatric context, and advising at least that in the great majority of cases, it's more helpful to take a more general formulation approach and say the presentation as a whole, the psychiatric illness, the rest of the presentation in general is in keeping with the attribution, but without using those magic and misunderstandable words. But I think if we can reach some consensus about it not being a very good idea to use these words generally and why it's not a good idea, I think that would be the best defense against the malicious undermining of the rules, because these words are so prone to misunderstanding.
I don't know if any of you would like to respond to that.
I think that's really helpful, distinguishing the three different ways the words are used. And I just wanted to add that one of the risks of using the consistency levels with psychiatric issues is that we'll all have a different interpretations of that. Because when I think about what convinces me that's to be really confident that some of what somebody's saying has happened is really subtle things, like, you know, how they tell the story, the nuances, the moment-to-moment nuances and how they tell the story, perhaps maybe witnessing a flashback and looking through the totality of that. But I don't know if that's the same thing that somebody else would be using to up the level of consistency psychologically. So I think the lack of any consensus really on what we might need as psychiatrists if we try to use it is another problem.
In one of the grim, I mentioned earlier some of the grim tribunal decisions, one of them by Justice Ousley, in which he talked about a medical report which shows consistency between the person's account and the person's presentation. And he referred back to the Istanbul Protocol kind of hierarchy of degrees of consistency and said, well, if what the doctor finds is that the presentation is consistent with the person's account, that really does no more than not negative the person's account, because it's consistent that there are multiple other causes, which was a pretty grim kind of evaluation for him to make of the value of medical evidence of that kind. And at first blush, depressingly, it seems to have been endorsed by the Court of Appeal in the MN and IXU case. I mean, that particular phrase of Ousley's was several times approved, that mere consistency, that was the phrase used by the judges, does no more than not negatively account. It's neutral, yeah. But I mean, the discussion then proceeded. It was going a lot more along the lines that you were suggesting, that that when the experts in that case used the word consistency, they shouldn't be taken. Reading their report holistically, it's clear that they weren't merely making an assessment, a sort of neutral assessment of what they found. That as far as they were concerned, when they talked about the person's presentation being consistent with the history that they relied upon, that indicated that they thought that their presentation was of significant probative value in terms of supporting the account. I mean, it was, I thought, a good way that the court approached that use of language. And
because there is another real error in the way of thinking about this terminology that you're describing, Ronan, because some types of injury can only ever be consistent. So if you are hit on the head with a rifle butt and knocked unconscious, that will only ever be consistent with being scar there, will only ever be consistent because people can be hit on the head by so many other things. So you could never have anything that was diagnostic of being hit on the head by a rifle. If you have a cigarette burn on your hand, or three of them, you know, one might occur by accident, but you know, three of them, you're being very careless. There are very few things. Some other circular instrument heated to a high temperature might give you a similar thing, but a cigarette burn will be at least highly consistent.
You can't prove me to that.
But well, you never. Well, that's the whole other bit. That's the whole. But we won't go there. But so that some types of injury, whether they're consistent or highly consistent or diagnostic, is inherent in the type of thing that's being talked about. It's nothing about the evidential strength of the account. So you know that's as far as it goes. That's the best you can say.
But then
that doesn't seem to be being engaged with in the sort of you're talking about.
Because importantly, the Istanbul Protocol goes on to say that what is most important is the overall assessment, and that's something which it doesn't. I don't think it kind of prescribes particular terms that the overall assessment has to be. No, but people do use that, and that was Juliet Cohen was advising you also use that. I think on Tuesday, wasn't she?
Yeah, that's the ultimate.
Yeah,
but
response.
But it's and as you're saying, Julia, no assessment of scars can say anything about the circumstances in which the injury occurred. It's all about mechanism. It's all about the plausibility of the mechanism that is described for the injury occurring. It says nothing about the situation.
Well, it can, but it's what we established in KB Sri Lanka, that it can, because it might tell you when the person gives their account, there may be certain features of the way the injury presents that's entirely consistent with the account. But isn't this going to be the difficulty with psychiatric evidence? Is that if what you've described is an experience of torture or ill treatment or trafficking, that is a traumatic experience. And if you've got symptoms diagnosed as PTSD, then that's a typical, and it's, you know, it's going to always be the highest level of consistency, because your diagnosis is of an illness that a psychiatric illness that has as one of its constituent ingredients an experience of trauma. So I don't know how useful it would be in any event, because that will always be your answer. I don't know whether if that was discussed at your meeting with the Istanbul Protocol one.
But the other thing is that not everybody who has that traumatic experience has the same reaction to it.
Correct.
Whereas everybody who's burnt by a cigarette has the same sort of effect on their skin within broad. You know, some of us are tougher than others, but you pretty well get a circular burn there.
Yeah.
But some people can see something horrific happen and not be affected by it. Others can not ever be able to think about anything else. It's not deterministic in the same way, and that's another thing that gets lost. We all vary in our response to psychological insight.
Dr. Sen, I think you were going to comment.
Yeah, I'm just interested in the kind of legal part. I'm just reminded of a forensic colleague of mine, Nigel Eastman, who used to say that when psychiatrists go into court, they're playing with the football themselves, they should change the ball and play with a rugby ball. Like that's what they're doing in court. So in that spirit, I'm just interested to engage with what you mentioned about the care of the tribunal, the judgment saying that if somebody has had a lot of trauma in the past, their mental health difficulties are explained by all this trauma, which is fine, one can understand that. And then, of course, they've had subsequently a number of traumatic events, including the asylum process. So they are where they are. So, and we are saying so complex PTSD and all of it as you described. But what is the legal point there? Then, if you're then putting this person back to what is another equally traumatic event, which is sending them back in this case, what is the judge saying that this is that, you know, this can happen, that, you know, they've had other reasons for their trauma, so it's all right to send them back there? What is the legal point? Because I suppose one could argue that we use a physical health analogy, that somebody who's got diabetes and severe diabetes, and you put them back to an environment where there's sugar all around them and they're gorging it. Is that conducive to their health? I mean, is that a human rights argument that they just put them back? So I'm just trying to understand the legal point which is coming out of that.
I mean, these would be in cases where the person is relying upon medical evidence, which they say supports their account of what has happened, in order to establish the reliability of their evidence generally, and to show that their history means that they are now somebody entitled to protection. They have been tortured, and therefore there's a risk they'll be tortured again, or whatever it is. I mean, they're not people who are able to say, well, they can't say and expect to win their case. They can't say, my PTSD, regardless of how it's caused, is such that it would be a breach of my human rights to send me back to wherever I'm from. I mean, that case won't, other than quite exceptional cases, that won't get off the ground. So it's really in the area of trying to establish credibility that these arguments about was the PTSD caused by the person's experience of being trafficked, or was it caused by the fact that they were sexually abused as a child and they never have been trafficked?
I see.
And the real kind of mischief of that kind of multiple possible explanations for the way the person presents is a couple of further assumptions or presumptions that Andrew Collins's and Uzi's cases both, well, hairs that they both set one in. I mean, one is that psychiatrists sit and listen uncritically to what they're told, and that they rely and entirely accept everything that their person tells them. Which means that if what they're told by that person is unreliable, then everything that follows in the report is of no value. That's one. And then the other is, well, these two guys didn't invent this. I mean, it's a longer established notion, but that asylum seekers have a propensity to tell lies in order to manufacture asylum claims. So it's those three things hand in hand that psychiatrists just uncritically accepts.
So it's on that narrow point of credibility. That's the
Yeah.
point here.
Yeah,
It wasn't about the broader point
it's
about.
not about the consequences for the person being sent back with the established psychiatric condition.
But it's also that it's not just about credibility, but the medical sessions and assessment should continue. We have had cases where the case was believed, credibility wasn't an issue, but it was refused regardless because the client felt that they didn't need any more session. That's very important because the expert needs to say whether they need any more sessions. What's the treatment? Where can they get the treatment?
I mean,
I think
that's
the
another-
I think that point that you made about treatments, it's got to be a much broader idea. It's about context, it's about community.
Essentially, the claim will pay, and it has paid. Obviously,
Because they've assumed there's no longer any
there's
need.
no longer,
I see.
there's no longer a need.
Yeah.
Which is very harsh, but
Yeah.
there we are.
So obviously, we've raised what's always the elephant in the room in this context is the culture of disbelief.
Yeah.
And the fact that courts focus on credibility as if it's an end in itself. And I wondered what from your work on the book, what kind of insights you would give us as lawyers about the relevance of credibility to your assessments.
Well, one thought that's partly about that is, and the issue you raised, Ronan, about this idea that psychiatrists just listen uncritically to what our patients tell us. We probably listen more critically than any other medical specialty because we're really trying to forever evaluate how much a person's own sense of a reality correlates with everybody else's sense of it. You know, we learn from the first stage to consider possibility of psychotic ideas, possibility of real misunderstandings and disjunctions between a person's experience of something and other people's experience. This whole thing, for want of a better term, sanity and madness is in the forefront of our minds. Now, that doesn't mean that we're listening to tell whether people are telling us the truth or not. That's not a dimension we engage with, but we do engage with critical listening. And we do engage with the idea that what people are telling us may be a version of the truth, whatever the truth is, but it's not necessarily the truth. So it's paradoxical that we listen in that way, we get this assumption that we're probably among the most credulous of medical listeners. I don't know where it comes from, but it'd be quite interesting to know.
Well, other judges haven't accepted that.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a really great judgment by Mr. Justice Moses, where he just kind of pours utter scorn on the idea that psychiatrists just sit there and just yeah.
I think there's a lot that we get from our training and experience, which is about observing. There's often quite a lot you can say about what you've observed, even in a 2-3 hour contact, which is part of what to you as the clinician might make you believe the person. I think there's I'm often unsure about how much detail to go into with that, because there's often a lot more that you can put in a report than you do. That's one thing. And I'm also really interested in thinking about, because working also as a psychotherapist and seeing people over a long period, the extra information you gather, which
adds to your conviction about truth telling. And I think that's also alongside, certainly in therapy, you start with the believing the person, you're dealing with what the person's bringing you and not trying to disbelieve, which is a position, but you're still observing. And I think we have a lot that we can say about that, which is about clinical skills, which is not just the general lay feeling about belief. At the same time, I know that when there's been studies of how good people are at knowing whether people are telling the truth, but I don't think clinicians do particularly well as identifying lying.
And could I just say, I mean, you said that, I mean, you don't know how much to put in your report of what you observed that makes you think that you're, I mean, I think that the more that is put in by the report writer to show why the person can be relied upon, the better.
But also what we can also say, these are other possibilities, and I'm not thinking it's this for these reasons, so that you know it's clear that you've thought about them.
And it's demonstrating the fact that you're thinking, and that you're thinking about people's state of mind when you're listening to what they tell you, because the other thing that you can comment on is how apparent discrepancies and contradictions in what people are saying to you can be a product of the state of mind they're in whilst they're talking to you. And I think those sorts of comments, in my experience, were always welcome in reports. And I always used to begin by asking people to just tell me about how they were living and where they were living. And you could learn so much from people describing their living arrangements about how they told a story about anything. So then you've got a sense of how people tell a story once they start to tell you about their other experiences, because their living arrangements aren't in dispute. Starting from, you know, where do you live? And they say, well, in a house with a red front door. You're already somewhere where in an understanding the sort of accounts they give you of their experiences.
I mean, I was at another meeting about the new Istanbul Protocol a few days ago, and I have to confess I haven't yet read it, but I was disappointed to hear that the new edition takes out the instruction to doctors that they should consider the possibility of fabrication as part of the exercise of writing a report. And it seemed to me that it might have been a misunderstanding of the effect of the KV Sri Lanka case that was responsible for that. Because one of the things that KV Sri Lanka suggested or found was that something as grotesque and extreme as getting somebody to anaesthetize you and then burn your back in order to manufacture a claim for asylum. It should not be assumed, and there should be no need to rebut that as a possibility because it is such an extreme. But I mean, I got the sense that that had been misunderstood as indicating that it should not be, the report writer should not assume the need to deal with possible fabrication. I think that would be really unfortunate with report writers.
It's taken out those 6 questions you're supposed to address in thinking about psychological causation. It's taken out, the 6th one used to be about fabrication, and now that's removed. And there are, the new protocol does give you other places to talk about fabrication. But I think it's really interesting, particularly in relation to psychological problems, because that is always the differential diagnosis of an account that somebody's, you know, somebody tells you I'm having flashbacks triggered by seeing policemen and I see the face of my torturer, so that the only alternative is making it up. And if they accompany that with a presentation which suggests they're really experiencing the moment, they're really distressed, then yeah, maybe they're fabulous acting, maybe they've got super acting skills and really good knowledge of what things should look like. But those are always the main alternatives causes, I think, of somebody's account of a psychological problem. And I think that is another difference between thinking about psychological consistency of psychological consequences and physical consequences.
I think the gentleman you called David, I don't know, maybe you could say who you are, we haven't really done that.
And I would say something about the question of fabrication. But I do think, first of all, for example, there's quite a lot of evidence. It's extremely difficult to consistently fabricate psychiatric disorder. So that's important, one can cite that evidence. Secondly, one's often got other reports or accounts that are consistent over long periods of time without consistency. Also, I often ask deliberately leading questions to see how people respond. Of course, if they're led, then as your Chris would say, that's got lots of possible reasons why they might be being led, but often they're not led. And that's quite interesting. You say to someone when they're describing a panic attack, and you say to get tingling your fingers, and say, no, I've never got that. That's never happened to me. And often you find, very often you find that people are actually very, very more careful than ordinary people, because the truth is so important for them that they're very, very specific about what their symptoms are like. Also, sometimes people say things that are completely counterintuitive. You wouldn't expect someone to say, and that adds something to the quality of the evidence. And sometimes it's also a reaction of people. I think of women who have been sexually abused. And a number of cases I've said to a woman, when you have a shower, you find you can't bear to look at yourself. Did you ever start injuring yourself and stretching yourself harder? I have one or two women say, how did you know that? How did you know that? There's a very, very striking response and not wanting to come within you and then being encouraged to continue. So I think there are lots of kinds of things. They're not, nothing is 100%, but they add weight. I think, from you.
Sorry.
Yes, of course.
Quite on the back of that, which is in the Borders and Nationality Bill, there is a desire for late evidence, especially in relation to trauma, not to be given, and this is my word now, the same credibility as early evidence. And it's how professionals deal with the issue relating to the issue of trauma, where people reluctantly revisit the trauma and the mental health issues that they deal with. How we reinforce that, because the Home Office, by the Nationality and Borders Bill, can now choose to dismiss evidence because it's brought in later in the process.
Yeah, I mean, it's that bill is that act is an act of revenge, because it's overturning so many things that we thought had been established, including the proposition that you've put there, which there will be categories of experience that are very difficult to disclose and are only disclosed when there's no other option to do so because you're facing removal. So I mean, there's cases going back very many years that established that, particularly in the context of rape and other forms of really shameful or experiences that are treated as shameful. So I think you're completely right to focus on that. And it was one other thing that I was going to raise is in terms of the current context, which we know it's been hostile for very long, but now we have a whole raft of new provisions that really do focus on making it very much more difficult to establish your claim, however difficult it already was. And so we've got section 32, which changes the burden of proof. So Ronan, what in terms of medical evidence, you said how important it is, but in a context now where, or have you experienced what's happened to you in the past? Have you had this past experience of torture or trauma? How important is medical evidence going to be in that context where you've got to prove on balance of probabilities as opposed to real risk?
I mean, I think there's arguments to be had about what the effect of that provision is and whether it does require something other than proving reasonable likelihood. But I mean, if it does have that effect, meaning that you have to prove your historical experiences on a balance of probabilities, I mean, that would be disastrous for huge numbers of asylum seekers, and it will just hugely increase the importance of having sort of good medical evidence to support the asylum seekers and can just hugely increase. And the difference between reasonable degree of likelihood or real possibility, real risk, and on a balance of probabilities is just immense.
it seems, I mean, with the current climate, it's going to be just so much, it's hard to get medical reports anyway, isn't it? So it's going to be so much harder to find people to do it. So, and you were talking about the torture ID where you work and the idea of doing kind of shorter reports, but you seem to be saying more detail.
Yeah.
The better.
Yeah, so I think maybe it would be helpful to explain about what is the idea of short form reports and how they might contribute to documenting claims of torture and treatment.
I suppose the idea of doing short reports comes out of the fact that most people don't get any medical evidence. Most people who experience human rights abuses and maybe have health consequences, in most cases that is not reported. It may well not even occur in the NHS records because the doctor may never have heard about the abuse, or the person may never have talked about the consequences. Only a small proportion of people ever get a medical report for various reasons, and of those who get a medical report, mostly it's years and years after the claim when they've already suffered the consequences of all that waiting and the refusals. So this organisation, Torture ID, was set up by the colleagues who were worried about that, were wanting to extend the reach of medical evidence. And I've set it up in the spirit of trying new approaches and exploring the impact of that. So there was an initial pilot in which 30 or 40 people were offered reports really early in the process, majority pre-decision, but offered really short reports in the hope that they could be diverted from all those years of waiting and long decisions and so on. And then there's been a subsequent project looking at providing later reports as well, but that's not fully evaluated. And the short, when I say short reports, they're not that short. They vary a bit according to the context. So there's one project looking at unaccompanied asylum seeking children who are referred by social services very early, and they might get something very short. People who referred post-decision would get something that looks a bit like an MLR, but is maybe half of it. I used to write for Freedom from Torture, and the reports I'm writing now are probably a third or a half of the length as I was writing for Freedom from Torture. There are huge questions about, are we omitting are they adequate? There are huge questions about that. There are huge questions about if short reports are adequate, have we short them in the right way? There's when you're looking at providing reports earlier in the process, which has got all sorts of good arguments in terms of people having the evidence being diverted from bad consequences where possible, but maybe most of them would have got a positive decision anyway. We don't know that. But then again, there are also lots of questions about long reports. Were they all necessary? Is it better to see more people with shorter? Is it better to see fewer people? Well, we don't know the answers to these questions, and I suppose Torture ID is an attempt to try something different with a learning process. I don't know, Chris, if you wanted to add.
No, I think that's.
I'd just say that Joe Miller, who ran that is the kind of one of the driving forces behind Torture ID, did present at the Istanbul Protocol seminar earlier this week, and so all of the results have been reported and they're available for people to see. And I think the idea behind another way of looking at medical legal evidence was to look at it very much from the point of view of the individual. What is the individual bringing into the room? What are the things that they are most concerned about? Because if you have a focus on writing about their, what's impacting them the most, it might be poor sleep, it might not be, it might be the fact that they can't go out into the world, or it might be the fact that they are so massively isolated, but the root of that is in avoidance. If you write from that perspective, you bring, a reality to the piece of medical legal evidence. Hopefully that will also make it more accessible to the reader, because I think one of the big challenges with any form of medical legal evidence is making sure that the door is not just open, but that the person can go on the journey through the report, that it makes sense to them, and that the person who's reading the report, who's the decision maker, at the end of reading that report is in a place that they are willing to accept and perhaps follow whatever the opinions are of the clinician who has written the report. So it was really about trying to take the elements of, if you like, the big four medical legal report and create a focus for them that was driven by what the person is bringing into the room, what lesions or physical injuries are they most concerned about, what differences to their behaviours are the biggest problem for them. And that then, in a 2 to 2.5 hour interview process, allows the clinician who's writing the report, and Joe Miller is the person who's written predominantly, I think most of the reports, I know Alison, you have written a number as well, and others have too. But I think her experience from working in a GP practice, where she had a lot of asylum seekers, is, you know, another factor in driving the need to find a more succinct way of providing the evidence that is focused, and that doesn't need to be this massive overarching epic piece of medical legal evidence that we are perhaps more used to writing in Freedom from Torture, or perhaps in Helen Bamber Foundation, or all the other organisations that, you know, are the bedrock of medical legal evidence in this country.
Can I just add to that? So I'm head of legal at the Helen Bamber Foundation. I oversee the medical report service. I think we're going to have to find a way to write shorter opuses on documenting ill treatment, because the way the Borders Act has been sort of inspired is we're going to need medical evidence earlier at so many different stages in the process. And when I and Freedom from Torture and Medical Justice, we came together in summer and Forest actually, and we looked at what bits of the Act are going to affect our service. The MLR service and the need for medical evidence was at almost every point in the bill, in the Act.
Yeah.
So, you know, we already have an overwhelming demand for our services. We will collapse under the weight of all those requests. And then, you know, if somebody's in the system for 2 years and they had a medical report 2 years ago, they're going to want an addendum. So we will collapse under the weight of that. So we're going to have to find a way to do something to kind of counter that. Otherwise, not only will we be crushed under the weight of the request medical report, but we don't want to add to the delay of thousands of people going through the system. You know, so I think we're going to have to find a solution to writing something that does the job, but it's going to be a trial and error piece, because we don't quite know how the Home Office is going to deploy the Borders Act. So
I mean, one of the things that is happening that in response to those pressures you're talking about is I'm also a trustee of torture ideas, so some sense of what's going on. But the reports are being driven much more by what the clinician thinks are the issues that need to be stated about the person, and they're not getting as involved in the things that the lawyers are interested in, like questions of credibility, like lengthy assessments of suicide risk, like all the instructions about how potential situations in the future about removal and receiving removal instructions that are going to affect their mental health. All those prognostic issues that are of great interest to lawyers, or were in my experience, are not being engaged with. It's more about having to say what's happened, how has it affected this person. Even lengthy discussions of suicide risk at every
So there are
stage.
short discussions of suicide risk.
Hmm?
There are short discussions
Yeah.
and comment on people's ability to give their accounts and comments on consistency.
I think one of the things that actually that you raised, Beata, which is very important, is that this was all the impetus came from Joe Miller, who is a GP, and GPs are used to achieving a great deal in 10 minutes.
But it is in the context where this Act reinstates the detained fast track process. So we know from experience that there'll be a pressure for reports to secure the release from the person who's in the detained fast track. And there'll also be the fact that if they do operate it within their timeframes, it's going to be something like 28 days. And we know how much strain and pressure the detained fast track put on organisations like the Helen Bamber Foundation and Freedom from Torture, and whether they'll be willing to, and the medical justice, to agree the sort of scheme that they had before, I think is very unlikely. So within the system, especially for those who are subject to the fast track process, is going to be essential. So I think that there is a need for whatever it's used for, and I can see that it has very many different helpful purposes. It will become critically important in the legal process to have some different mechanism for identifying issues that are relevant to the asylum claim.
I'm just going to say as well that in the Istanbul Protocol, the new chapter 7, which urges all health professionals to take up the duty to document, and if there is a disclosure, even if harm is suspected by the clinician, that there needs to be a record kept of that. And I think that is potentially a really useful thing, because it could mean that there are lots of different places in which there are threads that can then be pulled together, perhaps by a legal representative, maybe by a psychiatrist, that all then help to support not only the issues around the reliability of somebody's account, shows their credibility, but also maybe points to issues around future risks. So I think it's about, it does feel like a new era, the new Istanbul Protocol coinciding with the Borders Act. We are going to have to think differently. We're going to have to spread our net and encourage more people to take up that cause, to document carefully and precisely and with kindness, which I think is the point that was notable.
Cornelius.
One of the things that I'm just wondering might be whether rather than just thinking about short reports versus long reports, I think that we need to think about it, reports that are fit for purpose, and reports have different purposes and might look different because of those different purposes. A report to get someone out of detention might be different from a report to get someone not sent to land or whatever it might be. And so I suppose, what I always say when I'm training people in writing reports is that what one needs to do is think of it like a GCSE exam. One has to answer the question and show one's working. And that, I think, is quite a helpful approach, because the questions that one might be asked to answer are going to be different in those different projects. But as long as one has answered those questions and shown that one is working, shown why one has come to that answer in a robust way, then the report should, those last words, be fit for purpose. So I think part of what needs to happen is some more discussion between lawyers and doctors about templates, maybe about a rather simplistic but deliberately simplistic approach to saying, well, what is it that we're going to need for reports in this context? And that, I think, will enable shorter reports to be reviewed, and nonetheless to be fit for their stated purpose.
Yeah, I think I'd endorse that. The key thing that it seems to be coming from the discussion is the need for us to, in a concerted and focused way, to inform each other about how we best deal with the current situation that we face to assist our clients. And I know that that's a part of the book, is that it intends to be a process. And I wonder if you could just explain a little, or a dialogue, a little bit how you hope that would be the case. But you've got a website, haven't you, and how you're going to update it. So there's obviously I'm so skilled at asking the right question to get the answer. So would you like to tell us?
Yeah.
Go for the legal question.
We were writing
Tell us about your website.
in writing the book, we wanted it to last. And as things are changing so fast, there were some things that we didn't put in it. But we've got a website which is on the banner on the bottom, where things will be updated, so that there will be a way that we'll keep things up to date. But the issues that are talked about in the book are things that should be relevant always, really. And,
Just to make a brief point on the back of that, the Asylum Seeker and Refugee Working Group of the Royal College, which Cornelius chairs, there is a huge amount of interest among psychiatric trainees to get involved. There's a very buzzing trainees group. They have their WhatsApp, they're all very keen to learn. We've written some recent just highlighting exactly what you mentioned, the need for lawyers and doctors to work together, bearing in mind the implication of the Nationality and Borders Act, that we will need those faster reports, we will need templates, and kind of working together. We had a recent conference at the Royal College, that group, there's an annual conference, where we talked about the book, and there was a huge amount of interest amongst trainees who are coming through the system to learn. And almost every day in the WhatsApp, we get people saying, how can we get trained? And I think this is what we need to harness, because we need all those quick reports. I think we just need the new generation to harness better. And this book will serve as a great launchpad for that.
But I also think it will serve, I mean, I think what they are saying about every clinician noting accurately things about that they might be picking up. They might not be writing the expert reports, but for them to learn more about working with people seeking asylum, I think it's on both levels.
Well, we are slightly running over. I'm happy to keep going with the discussion. We will also be able to carry it on downstairs, but if you'd like to make your contribution, and then we'll see where we get after that.
Most people who are not accepted as having the right to remain do not in fact get sent back to their home countries. They remain in limbo in this country. I wonder to what extent that is affecting the thinking of psychiatrists, that in fact this person is not in much danger of being sent back home, and they are really in danger of their current limbo being prolonged. And should that be something that we should be bringing more into the content of our medical legal reports, the effects of delayed decision making?
Absolutely, that is a form. I used to deal with that in the treatment section. That the most potent form of treatment is to get people out of that lens, because I think a psychiatric report can be a very important piece of advocacy on that point. That the situations that people are living in are not the cause of their core problem, but they are very potent, precipitating, exacerbating, and maintaining factors for psychiatric illness. And that's a point I think that many of us make repeatedly in our reports to address that very issue.
I suppose it makes me, wonder what is life like for those people who are in that kind of limbo, because they probably don't get to the services. They're kind of not even eligible. I mean, it's a whole other piece of book written up.
Something very depressing that I just read, I've seen it in 2 reports from a Professor Greenberg, who you may know, where his answer to the impact of the limbo and is to be deported. So that are to be removed. That's what he says.
Just get it over with.
Then once you've got an adjustment disorder, you haven't because you've been refused asylum, you're in this system, it's been a delay, you've got an adjustment reaction to that, which causes you to have something that might be like depression. And the solution is to be sent back home, because once you're home or back to wherever you're someone else, it may be difficult and daunting when you first get there, but then you'll be fine and you'll recover. so there's no depths to which the perverse logic might go in terms of exactly dealing with the abusive consequences of the system and how it can be turned against an individual. But as you say, that's probably a whole other book. And what I hope is unless anyone's got a really pressing point that hasn't been made, we can carry on the discussion downstairs. There is it's a little bit of a route down there, but there's an opportunity to continue the discussion, to have a drink. And what I would say, the message coming out is that this is a discussion and a dialogue that needs to be turned into some form of concerted action along the type that's been said by Professor Katona and Dr. Sen about the ATA, so that we've got your email addresses now. We can contact you and follow up and have some more discussion about how we might progress what we've discussed today. It's obviously quite pressing, and in order to make sure that we do our best to challenge the hostility that we face, we need to take some steps to do so.
And thanks very much, Stephanie, for the invitation to come here and talk to everybody tonight. It was
Bringing people together, Alex, is really important, isn't it?
Yeah,
At the beginning
yeah.
of something.
it was very encouraging to get the invitation. And thanks for your hospitality.
Welcome.